All right, welcome back to Radio Wasteland, and our guest tonight is Jonathan Weiss, and we're going to be talking about New Orleans. New Orleans is one of those things that I think is in all of us as mysterious, and made all the more so because of media since then, like Anne Rice and stuff like that. So
Mhm.
it not only has the sort of melting pot history of weirdness going on, but it also has that Santa Cruz vampire level that's been thrown on, thanks to other stuff. But why don't you tell us a little bit about you, Jonathan, and what you do, so we can get this started?
Sure. I've been doing tours nearly 20 years in the city,
Mm-hmm.
which makes me pre-Katrina, which is kind of cool and kind of sad.
Yeah.
It's cool that I'm one of the, maybe there's 20 of us that are pre-Katrina still up in the whole city,
Oh.
Huh.
and I get to be one, and three of the other guys work with me. So we there's a cadre of the old hardcore guys who really know the history and the folklore and the legendary, and kind of want to express it all. They're not mutually exclusive. The history of our city is very strange and very blended with folklore. And I think it has to do with who we were, the people we were, and the waves of immigrants that came to join us. And also just the area we're in. The city and the area we're in had a lot of folklore and strange legend even before the Frenchmen showed up. So it's pretty cool to be able to work all these things together. And it's pretty easy to do it if you know what you're doing here.
Um, you brought up Katrina and being pre-Katrina. Did Katrina wipe out any of this history?
Oh, yeah, tons of it. I mean, the original French city is the French Quarter.
Mm-hmm.
And the original French neighborhoods are the two neighborhoods downriver of the French Quarter. And then the only other neighborhood the United States would know would be the Garden District. Ironically, the historic neighborhoods and Garden District didn't flood.
Oh.
So we were spared because the French built above water, and the Americans, when they built the Garden District, just happened to build on a ridge high enough that it didn't flood. But the rest of the city was essentially floodplain and completely was soaked. I mean, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I want to say that the day before Katrina, that'd be the 28th of August, 2005, there were 175,000 historic properties in the city of New Orleans. And by dark fall on the 30th of August, there were 75,000 historic properties in the city of New Orleans.
Wow.
Oof.
And the rest were completely wiped out, almost without exception. Some were heavily damaged and they've been able to be brought back into service, but the majority of houses we're talking about, homes in many cases, were completely destroyed, as in demolished. Americans are starting to see what a flood can do now. We're starting to see that kind of imagery more often. But like a tornado, it leaves nothing but a foundation. Flood does the same thing.
Right.
Yeah. Especially with like older buildings, right?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, they were
So-
wonderfully sturdy buildings, but I mean, when you got tons of water hitting a
Right.
1,000-foot frontage, it's just going to go away.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the reality of it. But it really did a lot of damage to our city's history and culture, because our neighborhoods are the repository of our city's history and culture completely. Like Brooklyn used to be like a neighborhood, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was a very neighborhood city. Philly was a neighborhood city. Boston is to some degree still a neighborhood city. New Orleans was the same way. So when you had 76, I think it was, identifiably different, recognizably different neighborhoods in a city of 450,000 people, that's small, right? That's a small city.
Yeah.
But every neighborhood had its own history and its own culture. And the people of the neighborhood were generationally repositories of that information and that kind of history. So when the neighborhoods got wiped out, we lost so much. It's really kind of harsh to think about it, especially if you're into history and folklore and things like that, because, I guess one of the coolest things for me of being pre-Katrina is I've been pounding the streets of the French Quarter so long that if you don't know me by sight, then you're the new one. Okay.
Right. Uh-huh.
But I was here before Katrina, and a lot of the old families that were still there in the quarter, there were still a few, knew who I was and knew I was trying to keep the folklore and the history alive and kind of show the flag of respect to the city. And they gave me pieces of their own family folklore.
Uh-huh.
And that is gold. If they don't tell me, I will never know. So that's what I really mourn, is that all these people are no longer there anymore, and they took a lot of the city's history with them. And that's kind of a heartbreaker for
That's
me.
devastating. Yeah.
Yeah.
So is your goal to, I mean, I know that you run the tours, but is your goal to somehow collect and archive that information as well?
I would love that. I mean, my ideal My ideal is people would come to my company because they'll just understand at a certain point, no matter what the tour is, Voodoo Tour, Cemetery Tour, History Tour, whatever it is, if you go through him, he will have the best guy. He'll know the best guy for it. He'll have the person who's the very best, most knowledgeable about the cemetery. So one of most, I've got a Voodoo Tour where a Voodoo priest leads a Voodoo Tour. Nobody else has one of those. So it's cool to realize, or that's the hope that people will understand. It's like, if you really want to know what this really means, if you want to know not the whistles and bells, but the real history, the real legend, he will know a guy. Go to him.
Right.
And that's my hope. And I'd like to kind of almost co-op with the other guys that are, strong historians and people who are really passionate about the city and passionate about the culture and folklore. So at least, like you're saying, we can archive it collectively, almost like a Lomax project. You know what I mean? But at least we have the stories. We can all tell the stories, kind of be on the same page and inform as well as entertain. And that would be ideal. I mean, it's I don't know if you know a lot of tour guides, but trying to get tour guides in New Orleans to all work at one point is very much like herding cats, except for the cats are usually, they'd have to be drunk and half mad. So,
right. Yeah. Well, it does seem like an interesting career choice. I've always thought it was interesting, kind of like a docent of a city or something.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it takes a specific personality to be able to do it, because I don't think I could do it, So
it does take a very specific personality. You have to have a lot of patience.
Yeah. And a lot of willingness to, retell the story. I'm sure there's a factor of that, is having a true love of the story enough to the point where when you're telling it your 15th time, you're still loving to tell it.
Yeah, that has a lot to do with it. But also, when you have a different group, every group is new. And, you realize that this is the first time they've heard it. Mm-hmm. So it might as well be the first time you're ever telling it. It really is, in that respect. You know what I mean? So it makes it easy to do when you enjoy what you're doing, and then you have people who are really interested in knowing.
Right.
It's very rewarding like that.
No, I can identify with that, because I have movies that I would never watch again, but if I have a chance to watch them with somebody who's never seen it, I find myself all sucked in again, going like, ooh, it's going to happen, because they're experiencing it for the first time. Let's talk about some of the history that makes, I think New Orleans is one of those places that we all go, oh yeah, they got this history. But, I don't know if we really know what it is. Like you were saying, voodoo.
I don't know much about, I had no idea. You mentioned a moment ago that there was sort of a folklore to the area before the French even arrived. See, I didn't know that. So
yeah.
I think.
So what was give us an example of the folklore of the area before the French arrived?
Well, one thing that's very cool is the specific area where the French Quarter is, the original city, the mile by half mile city. It was very specifically picked. It was not an accident. The French spent 20 years wandering in the bayous, trying to find where the Mississippi River, they knew where it started, up in Canada, right? They knew up in that area, Detroit, etc. They were up there, but they didn't know where it ended. So we're trying to find the tail end of the Mississippi River. And then once they found it, they were trying to find the best place to build a military defensible city, right?
Right.
But the thing is, that was such a perfect area. The natives, of course, they knew it was a perfect area too. They used it as a trading ground for centuries and centuries. There's an area of the French Quarter close to the river called the French Market. And it's actually considered the oldest trading post that we still use in North America as a result. But the thing that was interesting is that the Indians of the area wouldn't spend the night where we are. They wouldn't spend the night in the French Quarter. They wouldn't close their eyes, and it was the highest ground within 100 miles. Because they said, and they even tried to warn the French when they arrived, that the area was cursed. They said, do not build here, you'll regret it. And as I said, they wouldn't let the sun go down on their backs in the area of the French Quarter. They would always walk about 3 miles away, straight down a road called the Bayou Road that we still have today. And they would sleep essentially in a bayou rather than sleep on the high ground. And then they'd pack up and go back the next day for trades. But they would never let the darkness fall on the area. And I always thought that was just amazingly cool,
Yeah.
Yeah. Do we know what it was cursed weird. With?
Yeah, well.
Or is cursed for them maybe a looser term?
Cursed, I guess it could be a looser term. It can be a looser term for us today. But
yeah, that's true.
I think in specific, I understand why they consider this ground cursed. And it's something I go into in my dark history tour, which I, by the way, am the only person in the city who does, because it's generally a wonderful city for the really horrible things that made us what we are.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
You would think there would be a lot of people embracing this sort of dark history of it, because so many of the rest of us sort of associate, well, we don't associate it with being a dark place. We also associate it with being a party place, and we associate it with history and, ethnic melting pot. We associate it with a lot of things, but a dark history, like you were saying, voodoo is definitely something that I feel that people kind of associate New Orleans.
Oh, yeah. With good reason. Yeah. Voodoo in our city is very much alive and well. Very much alive and well.
Even today.
Oh, God, of course. Yeah. Before COVID, and hopefully soon, the next couple of months, once we get a level of immunization in our city and around the United States, for years and years and years in what they call Armstrong Park, which was originally called Congo Square, is a place where slaves would gather on Sundays to dance and sing and make their own trading ground, if you will. They would sell goods, barter goods back and forth to each other. And it was really, really an area of open air worship. It was open air voodoo. But they were very good about hiding it from the eyes of the Catholics around them, and then later the Protestants around them. So, and it's literally just across the street from the city, across the street. So to this day, until COVID, voodoo practitioners were still having regular Sundays in the square. They drum, dance, sing. They bring things they bake and sell, things like that. I mean, literally, it was exactly the way it was 250, 300 years ago. So that's a really cool thing. And like I said, my buddy who does my voodoo tours with me, he's a voodoo priest. And the reason we only go on Sundays because I want people to be able to go and actually experience that and see the drumming and see the dancing and see the veve artwork and buy some crafts, buy some food if they want to, and just kind of mingle amongst people and see and watch and kind of demystify it, make it not so scary, but also explain it really as a vibrant, passionate, artistic religion.
Yeah, well, that's definitely my next question about voodoo is voodoo as dark as we have it in our heads, or have we been historically brainwashed by the Christianity we've all grown up inundated with?
I would suggest it's B rather than A. The racism inherent in the Hollywood depictions of voodoo, and of course the Christian literal demonization of voodoo has irreparably imprinted in the minds of people what voodoo is. Catholicism is a lot like voodoo, because voodoo is about 2.5 times older than Catholicism recognizably. But they have very similar concepts, including it's a monotheistic religion. There's only one God.
Oh, really?
But just like Catholicism has saints and archangels. Voodoo has what they call lua, great spirits, and they are analogous to saints and archangels, and they have things they're responsible to God for. He gave them tasks to perform and things to be, if you will, in guardianship over, like a patron of conflict or a patron of love, things like that. So just like in the Catholic Church, rather than going to light a candle for a saint, you just bring gifts to the voodoo altar of the spirit you're speaking to. And you're petitioning that spirit to help you with a problem. The spirit receives its power from God. So it's really not that unfamiliar to Christians when you break it down.
Yeah.
I mean, I was raised Catholic, and there's definitely the pantheon of saints, and that makes a lot of sense, that comparison,
Yeah, if you understand Catholicism at all, it really does make a lot of sense. If you understand Wicca, it makes a lot of sense. So there are a lot of pagan religions that have similar practices to voodoo, as it was said in French.
So I'm getting all caught up in voodoo because voodoo's interesting, but
everything's interesting, man.
Everything is interesting, but in every other state, I can imagine a huge amount of Christian pushback to any public voodoo gathering. Is there any of that there?
Usually it's not from the city.
No.
We get people who come in from Mardi Gras and other festivals screaming that we're all going to go to hell because Jesus loves us, so we're going to burn, that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah.
The Jesus haters, the ones that are the death cultists, they love Jesus, but they hate everybody else. But those people usually come from, Texas or Mississippi or Florida or Kansas or something like that. They're in no way, shape, or form locals. They're really there just to make themselves martyrs because that's kind of key to their identity.
Right.
The Catholic Church, I really don't know what the official position of the Catholic Church is. I suspect with the new Pope, it's just benign tolerance, respect for different religions.
Sure.
But we actually, 2 years ago, we had the Dagba, who is essentially the Pope of Voodoo, West Africa, who came to New Orleans and visited with us and, received by a deputy of the mayor, the whole thing. So
oh, wow.
It's still very alive and very real. And it's interesting, too. It was easy to hide it inside the Catholic faith because they had so many similarities. That's why it survived and flourished here.
Yeah, that kind of brings up, I've always wondered, is voodoo in New Orleans sort of different than voodoo elsewhere? Is it a regionally specific thing? Yeah.
Absolutely. New Orleans voodoo is much more like the city. It's strange. It seems like voodoo, to some degree, takes on the character of where it is and molds itself in that way. New Orleans voodoo is a lot more friendly.
Religions. Yeah.
Yeah, but New Orleans voodoo is much more friendly. It's much more open. It's much easier to be involved in New Orleans voodoo. It comes from the Haitian root, without a doubt. And the Haitian root is a lot more Catholic in that things must be done this way by this person at this time. But New Orleans voodoo is a little more comme ci, comme ça. It's a little more loose like the city is. It's more like you're making a relationship with a spirit. It's almost like you're making a friendship with a spirit.
Huh.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, totally interesting. So on the dark history, obviously we're not hugely talking about voodoo. What's some of this dark history of New Orleans? Are we talking killers? Are we talking ghosts? We talking?
You name it, brother. I mean, generally in my dark history, I cover a variety of things, and as many things as I can pack into 2 hours with a break. There's still tons of things I don't ever get to tell because we don't have the time. I really try and cherry pick things that happened in our city's history so people can understand where we were in time, if you will, as we go through the streets. We burned down 2 times within 6 years. And in the late 1700s, and those fires were genuinely devastating. To no small degree, we genuinely lost the first 7 decades of the city's history up in smoke on 2 very bad nights.
Wow.
So that alone, the destruction that was wrought by those fires, is something that's dark. The misery that followed, having an entire city from 863 buildings reduced to 7 buildings in 6 hours. All the food stores, all the medicine, all the shelter, all the clothing stocks completely destroyed. And you've got thousands of people who are trapped in a bayou. That's like a horrible Hollywood, disaster movie, except for it really happened here.
Right.
Epidemics, slavery, of course, was big in New Orleans. People get very confused by New Orleans because we're so overwhelmingly sensual and we're overwhelmingly just constantly in your face. And it's a completely different world than the rest of the United States. But big surprise, New Orleans is the deepest part of the Old South. And so slavery in our city was very, very real and very big. So I talk about that. I enjoy talking about that. It's interesting to get people's reactions. And I think more people are happy that I'm not willing to shy away from it because it's kind of stuff that, we need to talk about it.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. When we think about the South, I still think of the South as being pretty socially segregated, although I've never really been there. Just from talking to people and watching TV, I don't know if this is a preconceived notion that I have, but I view it as still socially pretty segregated. But I kind of view New Orleans as not being that. Am I wrong with my assumptions?
No, generally New Orleans, I think, is probably the most well integrated of the southern cities. And I think it has to do with our neighborhoods were predominantly class-based rather than race-based.
Right. Yeah.
For example, the neighborhood immediately downriver of the French Quarter is the Marigny. That's my neighborhood. And it was part of a plantation originally, and it was made into a housing development around 1805. And the thing is, though, Bernard de Marigny, the man who owned the properties, just sold them to whoever had the money to buy the properties. So you had free Black people, you had poor Frenchmen and Spaniards, you had German and Irish immigrants coming into the neighborhood. And so you quickly developed this neighborhood just across the street from the French Quarter's boundary that was extremely religiously and ethnically and racially integrated, mixed. Plus, you know, our traditions of our history here has to do a lot with genuine physical racial blending. People in New Orleans are very mixed blood people to no small degree.
Right. And that's one reason why I view them as so integrated, is because those lines have been blurred so drastically through relationships and
yeah, it's kind of funny because in New Orleans to this day, you can always tell when somebody lives here, when somebody just moved here, or somebody lives in the suburbs. Because you say, what part of town you from? And they say, oh, I'm from here. In New Orleans, you always say your ward or your neighborhood.
I see.
Sometimes you say you cross streets.
Right.
So there's little cues, little tricks like that. New Orleans is a funny city because it's been such an immigrant city, but it's been such a target for hucksters and carpetbaggers and people trying to make a buck off of us forever, that I think a lot of New Orleanians are somewhat suspicious of outsiders to a little degree. So we always have these strange tricks, like how we pronounce words, how we pronounce street names, for example. Right. It confuses people and turns them upside down. And it's just kind of like, I think, almost like a vetting process to speak to a New Orleanian. If you understand about half of what they're saying, you're pretty good.
Well, you know, there's probably that apprehension because, I mean, once a year, you guys do hold one of the most famous parties in the world, and it probably does not bring in the best from around the world on a reg. And, you know, there's probably a lot of like, oh, God, it's the outsiders again, you know?
Yeah, I mean, we love hosting people, but we do get a little tired of people not remembering that this is a city where people live in a neighborhood.
Right.
It's not a place to come and vomit on a front porch.
Right.
We'd really appreciate if you didn't do that. That'd be cool. You didn't pee on our crux. So yeah, we get a little jaded, but generally we actually do like people pretty much. We love to host people. We're very proud of our city, so we love to show it off. That's one of the reasons that COVID's been so disastrous for us. I mean, after Katrina, as bad as it was, we could at least socialize. We could sit in the bars and restaurants. We could drink together. We could go to music shows together. And we could all kind of commiserate. But we are arguably the most social people in the United States, and we literally can't be close to each other.
Right.
So it's been a real kind of a double punch for us this year. The past year, it's been tough.
And I get that because I'm here in Ashland, Oregon, which is a small town, but it's based around a Shakespearean festival, and that's where a huge amount of the dollars for the locals comes in, and that was all shut down this year.
That's
so
like the entire town. So
right, you know, so none of that money is coming through town.
Tourism. Yeah. Basically,
the town is 20,000 people, but through the summer it has 300,000 people pass through it. You know, so I mean, it was a big hit on the town, and I'm sure you guys are experiencing that as well.
Yeah, our music club's been closed for more than a year.
So, you know,
let's talk about the supernatural stuff. Yeah,
sure. All right, supernatural stuff. What do you think would be the most famous haunting in New Orleans? If I were to, the most famous, the one that people know the most, at least in the area.
The one that tourists know the most is the Lollery House. American Horror Story season 3, Coven. Delphine Lalaurie, Kathy Bates' character.
Oh, really?
Delphine Lalaurie was the infamous torture mother.
That's based on. I've seen that. I didn't know it was based on it. Okay. Go ahead. I'm listening.
Yeah, Delphine Lalaurie was a real person. Marie Laveau was a real person. The Axeman of New Orleans was our first serial killer. These are all characters. Yeah, these are all characters in. Yes, the Axeman is on my Dark History tour, in case you're wondering.
Yeah.
But these are all real people, and these were all real breathing. We're presuming breathing because the Axeman was considered a demon. Real people, real characters, living characters of the city of New Orleans historically. Delphine Lallaurie's house, the Lollery House, or as people mispronounce it, Lalaurie. The Lollery House is the most infamous haunting in the city, and the building is really haunted. I mean, it's a no joke, really howlingly haunted place. I've got amazing photos on my phone that were taken on tours. One of my favorite one is 2 ladies are taking a photograph, click, click, that quick, side by side. Ghosts can appear so quickly, it blows your mind because these shutters snap a quarter second apart. The first photograph you can see this misty shape forming approximately 2 feet in front of the woman, a heavy misty shape. But by the second photograph, a half second later, you can already see the head and shoulders have developed in a waistcoat.
Wow.
And literally, it's like a man who was standing right in front of these ladies, staring at them, saying, "Can you see me?" That close, that creepy. Photographs were
could they see him, or was it just in the picture?
I'm sorry.
Sorry. Could they see him, or was it just in the pictures?
No.
Yeah.
Just in the pictures. You know, most adults can't see dead people. Photographs where people are standing in the doorway, standing on the balcony. There's nobody there, but they're looking, literally sitting there, staring down, listening to you. That's why photographs, cameras are so much fun. You can really, if you think you're paranormally sensitive, you can find out with your phone because it's got a camera. So anytime you feel something strange, if you start photographing the area and you're getting things, then you know that you're not insane. It's kind of handy like that. But we get all kinds of stuff like that. I mean, when I do my tours, for example, when I do my ghost tour, I don't take people to Lottery House. It's overdone. It takes several minutes to walk down there. It's a big story. If you know about it, you don't need to hear about it. If you don't know about it, quite honestly, I don't think you need to know about it. It's horror. It's like a Saw movie. It's nothing but torture porn. There's nothing redeeming or hopeful or instructive except for how vicious and cruel the super rich can be. And I think we kind of already know that.
Yeah,
right.
No, that's.
But so there's nothing hopeful, helpful, or redeeming about it. And quite honestly, it's hard to actually tell the real story because the things that really happened. I use quotes from the newspapers of the time period, and people wince when I use quotes that were written in a newspaper 170 years ago. Okay, 180 years ago.
Yeah.
You don't have to make things up about it. So when you're sitting out in front of it and you're trying to get people to pay attention about how something that's really grim, but they want to know about it, all right, you pay me for it, I'll tell you. But you'll have half a dozen other tour companies around you who are just screaming the most inane things because they're all trying to out-sensationalize each other. So that's a real frustration for most experienced tour guides. And the best thing about working for myself is I don't ever have to tell that story again because I don't want it.
Well, what is the story?
Stories. I'm sorry, there are other stories nobody knows.
Yeah, but what are the stories that you do want to tell? Like if you're going on a tour and they say, we want you to take us to the place that you want to go the most, where's the place that you take them at that point?
Oh, God, there's so many cool places. The places I pick on my tour are places that have a resonance for me, a lot of experiences for myself, places that are historically extremely important that I also know have a lot of ghost activity. One of my favorite stops I love to take people to is one of the only 3 French buildings we have in our city. There's only 3 French buildings left after those fires. And the building is cool because it was a home almost the entire time. From 1726 to 1964, people like us were born and grew up and raised their families and died in the building. So it's the only home we've got. It's also was originally the home of a very well-off family. So it would have been a very rare building. But the very first people who lived in the building had a husband had a horrific fate. And his wife was 19 years old, 2,000 miles away from her family, with a 3-year-old daughter, and no training and no skills and no money except what was in the building, no food, no way to get a job because she's a woman and she couldn't remarry for a year in our Catholic city. So she literally was in one of the worst places, most desperate places any woman could ever be in. So telling that story, automatically I can connect to a lot of the women in the audience, because they've all felt completely trapped, completely, just pinned down by society and by life. And it's a story that's great because you can explain who she is, get people to sympathize with the woman, then explain how it all happens, then explain how she survived it. So there's kind of a cool little roller coaster and people invest in that story. It's a great story, but I can also tell the ghost activity that happens because of her, because of what she endured, because of that horror she experienced, and why she's still in the building to this day. She's one of my favorite photographs. I got a picture of her walking her gallery, just pacing back and forth along her gallery with her long train of her dress dragging up the staircase. She's literally making physical contact with mortal plane.
Huh.
Which is pretty cool, yeah. But it was her home. Of course, she knows exactly every single square inch of it. So that's a story I love to tell because it explains who we are, and it also lets people understand why ghosts are around, what makes them motivated to stay places. One of the other buildings I like to go to is the oldest tavern in the city. It's a great place to take a break and the oldest bar in the city. But it's also got an incredible haunted history because it was essentially an end of the city that was given over to organized crime for 200 years. Whether it was the Pirates of the Caribbean, whether it was the first Sicilian Cosa Nostra mafia in the United States, which actually is in New Orleans, not New York. Whether it was the modern organized crime, 200 years of organized crime ran that into the city. And as you might guess, a bar in a place like that would have had a lot of incidences in and around it, including killings in the modern day. Stick-up artists trying to stick up the wrong man, getting shot in the head right at the entryway, that kind of stuff. Right. It's got a lot of ghost activity, but not only because of the violence, but because we're what the French call them côté de boire, drinking culture. Our lives revolve completely around our taverns, cafes, and restaurants. And our families are so old and our businesses are so old, it would not be uncommon at all in the city for a man to take his son for his first legal drink at the place his great-great-grandfather had his first legal drink. Huh. Generations, family make relationships with businesses, with restaurants, with taverns. And as a result, because you're so interconnected to every part of your life in these buildings, because you die doesn't mean you leave your favorite bar.
Right.
So we get a lot of ghost activity that are obviously the recently dead in our city, a lot of it, whether it's little old ladies with chunky purses walking down the sidewalk to go to the parish church, or whether it's men sitting at a table at their favorite bar who've obviously been dead for a little while because of the gray-green color of their face and the black pits where there should be eyes, to men who've been murdered in a building and are still waiting around 200 years later. I mean, there's so much everywhere we go, so much we can talk about. And as a result, I never run out of things to tell people. It's just like, again, I'm trapped for time, and I select certain stories that I think will illustrate, for example, the ghost attitude of the city of New Orleans. Not the jump out from the corner, scream, scary kind of crap, because almost all that stuff around the world is going to be completely made up. But the real, genuine, it really happens a lot. Take photographs, you'll be surprised what you catch on camera. Reality of ghosts in our city.
Now, is the ghost tour your most popular?
No, I'd say actually my dark history is most popular because everybody and their mother offers a ghost tour. Most of them are the exact same story told over and over again because they're all using the same scripts. I generally have a loathing for scripts because, you need to be able to read and ask questions and listen to answers. But I think my ghost tour is cool. I mean, the best compliments I've ever had on my ghost tours, I've done at least half a dozen ghost tours, and I've never heard any of the stories you're telling us. Oh, that's a good compliment.
Yeah,
that is good.
That's something I love. That makes me so happy.
So, what is the dark history one then? It's sort of a smattering of like some ghost and some other stuff, and a collection, or is it a conceptual difference that I'm not understanding?
It's really a conceptual difference. I mean, if I talk about ghosts. And I just mentioned ghost activity on my dark history tour because when you have massive deaths and heavy trauma, there will be ghosts left behind. It's just going to happen. Right. So, for example, I talk about slavery in a place that was once a slave pen, literally on the spot. But the building's more than 200 years old, and it was a home a large part of the time period. One of the owners committed suicide upstairs at the beginning of the 19th century. So he's very much in the building. But the fact that it's literally on the spot of a slave pen, a slave corral, it's a good place to talk about slavery. And as you might guess, you have these people who've been ripped away from their homes and have spent, weeks, months in a stinking hold, and they arrive in a savage new world. And if you don't think that you called on the most savage curse you can imagine with someone who literally stole your life, they're from West Africa, they're carrying the voodoo with them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, this is the kind of stuff that leaves those marks behind metaphysically. So, I'll talk about the dark history of the place, but I'll also mention some of the ghost activity because I want people to understand how very intense the building is historically and how many things just layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of things do leave resonance behind. But, I talk about all kinds of horrible things in the city, great epidemics that we suffered. We suffered an epidemic every year from about 1720 to 1905. It would kill thousands or tens of thousands of people every year from just, a single disease.
Why is that? Is it just bad luck, or was there?
We're in a bayou.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Okay. I guess that's a silly question.
We're in a bayou. A tropical environment, so
Yeah. Okay.
Nobody understood germ theory. Most children most people really wouldn't wear shoes a lot in the early days. Even in the late 1900s, early 20th century, children didn't wear shoes because they were pretty poor, right?
Right.
So a barefoot and a rusty nail is a dead child.
Right.
For most of the city's history. So, I mean, it's this kind of the simple fact of reality of life is what makes us so dark, you know? Great fires, slavery, torture and execution in the squares, piracy, crime, serial killing.
What about witchcraft? Was there any witchcraft in the area? Or would we just call the voodoo the witchcraft and it wasn't?
Well, that's a really hard thing to parse because witchcraft means a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
Right.
You know, it's very hard. You could say swamp witch.
Mm-hmm.
Swamp witch would be an appropriate thing. However, that would really be more along the lines of what people call hoodoo, hoodoo.
Yeah. I've always wondered what's the difference between hoodoo and voodoo.
Well, one of the voodoo practitioners I know of says hoodoo is what's left over when the religion of voodoo has been forgotten.
Okay.
So you don't know why you're doing things, but you're doing things. It blends in with Native American as well as European, Native American traditions, as well as European witchcraft. And it kind of makes its own little weird savory blend, hoodoo. So hoodoo is really prevalent in places like the Carolinas and Georgia, coastal areas like that. Certainly there's hoodoo all over Louisiana as well. It's that blend of European and Native American and slave practices all mixed up together. But it isn't a religion. It's a specific, if you will, skill set. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. No, it does. It does. You don't necessarily know the history, you know the effects. And so, you know, you were saying a swamp witch, which I got to say, I like that term. I am a fan of horror films, and swamp witch is hitting me in a good way. You know, is that something that's real, or is that just a crazy hermit lady living out there that everybody says is a swamp witch, or do they claim to be the swamp witch?
It's real. I don't know that they would necessarily claim to be the swamp witch per se.
That might not have been the best words, but you get where I'm going with this.
If you consider in the bayous, the Cajuns in the bayous, they have their own traditions, their old folklore as well. Prater is a word that's used, and that's essentially a spirit healer. Not really a faith healer per se, although they can be religious overtones. But people are considered, you know, just blessed with healing abilities. Mm-hmm. That's still very much a strong tradition in the bayou. So I guess you could say the healing thing would be sort of the benevolent side of the swamp witch. I guess that would be maybe a fair way to put it.
Somewhat shamanistic, it seems.
Yeah, well, because there's Native American influence, no doubt at all, sure. But it's, you know, people oftentimes are said to be born with a power or born with a skill. So they're brought in as an apprentice and they're taught the traditions. You know, I know some people who their grandmother was the Platea. Their grandmother was the swamp witch, but for reasons of her own, she declined to pass on her information. Even to the one point of burning everything, burning all her notes, burning all her books, burning all her papers. Wow. This would be, you know, early 1920s, 30s. Mm-hmm. For what reasons, I do not know, but she still mourns it to this day that her great-great-grandmother declined to pass on her knowledge.
Yeah. Because, I mean, there's so much history there that's probably just lost because it was all...
Absolutely.
It was verbal and on paper, so disposable.
Yeah.
You know, I think for some reason we all associate... Here you have a vampire tour. Yes. And we all associate vampires with New Orleans, but outside of Anne Rice, I can't think of why I do that.
Yeah, is it just Anne Rice, or is it?
Well, obviously, it can't just be Anne Rice, or there wouldn't be a tour.
Right. It's not just Anne Rice. She certainly popularized that of vampires in New Orleans for the modern pop culture, but you know, there've been old legends in the city for a long time. You got to realize, you know, the people who found the city of New Orleans are, with almost without exception, going to be peasants. They're going to come really genuinely from the earth. This is a city that essentially was built to be essentially a military strong point city. But its first population were all convicts. Mm-hmm. I mean, all convicts. So you have people who are the street sweepings of Paris, people who came from Canada. The original Frenchmen came over here, and a lot of them were just very poor people of the lower class, but they all had their own legends, their own folklore. And of course, it would blend into the area. When you add to the fact that this is a city that was incredibly dangerous in the first 30 years we're here, I read something that said the annual death rate of the city of New Orleans is estimated to have eclipsed 80% twice in the first 30 years we were here.
What?
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, you're in the
Must have been
bayou.
a big influx of people then.
Oh, yeah.
To
I mean, they emptied the prisons. They emptied the prisons. They sent people again and again. The madhouses, the homeless, everybody. I mean, you could go on Bourbon Street today, you go prisons, madhouses, homeless. Okay, makes sense. But literally, it was the people that they found to be the least useful in France were sent here. This is kind of the ass end of the French Empire. It's the place that nobody, including the soldiers, wanted to be sent. So it was just a dumping ground. So these people are rough and tough and violent and vicious. They're traditionally used to solving something with a knife. Okay. And as a result, you got hundreds of men who are usually armed and usually drunk. There's not enough women.
Right.
You know, so gambling, liquor, it was just going to be a death trap for a very long time. Then you add disease, then you add the Native Americans, then you add, just the wildlife.
Mm-hmm.
So it was generally a terrifying and extremely dangerous place. And as a result, people would vanish and people would die all the time. And then you have people vanishing and dying all the time. You have these very superstitious people. And then you add a little bit of our history, the things that actually did for sure happen. And all these things blend together and create the idea of vampires in the city of New Orleans, which is extremely cool. Folklore. But there also have been a large number of murders over the course of several, 100 years, where people have literally been hunted, killed for blood. I mean, murdered so someone could take their blood. It has happened at least 5 or 6 times that I know of in the city of New Orleans in the past 150 years or so. So these are bits of old folklore. These are bits of strange murders, and they kind of all sort of tie in together. And, there's a building here that I'm really sure that it's the point from which all the vampire folklore of the South really would start, is one building in New Orleans. And that's kind of, if you will, the star of the tour, because I can tell people how it all happens. And that makes a cool sense, because by the end of the story, you'll understand how the history and folklore are very tight. The building itself is very strange, very mysterious. And it's got a lot of strange folklore around it as well as being a site of a very interesting double murder about 50 years ago. So it's just creepy and cool. And it's one of those things that my goal is, by the end of the tour, I want you to be less sure about everything you knew when you started. Because I start about everything from, vampire folklore around the world. I like to, when I have a good group of people, I like to say, all right, you tell me what you know for sure about vampires, and I'll tell you what's true or false based on the oldest folklore, and I'll tell you what. And I think that's a good way to start a tour like that, because we can get all the tropes out and I can explain it to them. But hopefully by explaining the logic behind the tropes, they come to the realization that our ancestors took this extremely seriously. This was an existential threat to our ancestors, that the dead are outside watching in, and they're watching you.
That's interesting, because I didn't think there were a lot of French vampire myths.
Sure. Cauchemar. Oftentimes you might guess they're a little more sexy, being French. But yeah, of course. The idea that, Cauchemar is a traditional one. It's very much like a succubus or incubus.
I haven't heard of that.
Very
Which one?
cool.
What is that one?
Cauchemar.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look that up.
But you really, people don't really realize it, because let's face it, the Age of Enlightenment, really to no degree, small degree, starts in France, right? A lot of the old superstitions were put down, put away, thrown out, burned away, right?
Right.
But they were absolutely as superstitious as anyone else in the European world.
Yeah, I thought I had this misconception of it as sort of a Eastern European, and then you also get sort of Asian vampire myths and Middle Eastern vampire myths, but
that's you're talking about a huge part of the world at that point.
Well, yeah, I know, but
don't forget Africa.
That excludes Western Europe. I didn't think there were
North and South America.
Western Europe. Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of neat, because it's estimated about 98% of every culture that ever existed or exists has vampire legends in them. Okay. And six of the 7 continents men call home seem to have vampire legends native to them. So that's kind of a cool thing too, that it's always been with our people forever and ever and ever and ever. And it's neat when you get the same folklore separated by the entire planet in 3 different or more cultures.
By the oceans, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, for example, vampires are seen in many cultures as a shapeshifter, never the bat.
Mm-hmm.
Bram Stoker made the bat out. But they're often seen as 3 different types of animals: raven or crow, wolf or black dog or cat. Okay. And in Ireland, the main form of the vampire was seen as a black dog. In North Africa, it's a black jackal or black hyena. In the Philippines main island, Luzon, it's a black dog. Now, those cultures arguably do not cross, do not meet, but they have the same legend. And that's, I think, really fascinating when you start digging into this and seeing how far it goes back in human history. You know, the earliest writing really is early Sumerian, closer, you know, more like 5,500 years old than not. But in the earliest tablets of human writing, we get vampire legends in them. There were vampire warnings from them, from the Sumerians. So that stuff is just really fascinating. And when you start going through it and realizing the similarity of story that goes on for all of human recorded history and probably beyond, because of course they were oral tales before they were written down, it makes it a really interesting tour if you go in with an open mind and you don't mind a little murder and you don't mind a little folklore, a little history, and just some genuine weirdness, all mixing it together and kind of tying the bow, package with a bow.
So the vampire myths in New Orleans, do we think there's, you know, you talked about the danger and so forth. Do we think that at some point there were supernatural monsters in New Orleans hunting people for their blood? Was it?
If there was any part of the world where a creature like that could prosper, where do you think it would be?
Well, I mean, New Orleans would be great, but
9 million visitors in 2019. 9 million people came to visit. That is literally 20 times the size of the city's population came to visit. Not all of them went home.
That's fair.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, you know, could you imagine a better place where as long as you didn't screw up, you'd survive, and you have millions of people, many of them were drunk.
Right.
I mean, I'll tell you this is true. Before Katrina, not where tourists could see it, but on the neighborhoods just around the corner, there was not a single telephone pole, not a single electric lamp pole that didn't have its share of missing persons posters. And they weren't little girls. They weren't little boys. It was most often men between the ages of 22 and 32. And the most common notations on a missing person poster in New Orleans were the words, "last seen on Bourbon Street."
Yeah, that makes sense.
Wow. Okay.
Huh.
Yeah, my city's a little weirder than most people think.
Yeah, well, I mean, you asking those questions. If ever I'm a vampire, I'm just going to go back and forth between New Orleans and Vegas, apparently.
Yeah, you know, why not?
Yeah.
It's a pretty sweet life, to be honest with
you. So the people who come on these vampire tours, are they vamp fans? It's like, I imagine that the people who want to go on a vampire tour all look like Kara.
Okay, now. I would definitely go on a vampire.
Yeah, I know.
That would be my first stop in New Orleans.
Is it a bunch of Karas, or do you get little old ladies on these things? Or
yeah, I mean, I honestly, I think I've made more friends from doing a vampire tour than anything else, because you know,
awesome.
I have a very good friend of mine who is a Unitarian priest, and I met her doing a vampire tour. I've had people who are nuns on my vampire tour, genuinely.
Yeah.
I've had, you know, you name it. I've had serious goths. I'd have people who just thought it'd be kind of a lark.
Sure,
People who are into the paranormal and the occult, people who are true believers, people who are true skeptics. And, you know, I always try and people, it's like, the deal I'm going to make is I'm not going to tell you what to believe.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to tell you what I know, and I'll tell you what I think if you ask me, but I'm not going to tell you what to think, because I don't like having people try and sell me an idea on a tour.
Sure.
So I like to present it and let people make up their own decisions and conclusions based on what I say and based on what they think and based on the questions they ask. I think that's a very fair way to do it. But, you know, it's kind of weird. I guess it comes and goes along with the popularity of vampires and what's making it popular. I mean, obviously when Anne Rice was writing consistently in the earlier days, and of course you had Interview the Vampire and Queen of the Damned coming out, it was a different group of people than the ones who come out for Vampire Diaries and the originals.
Right.
Oh, yeah. I can imagine.
There are also a lot of vampire folk or vampire fictional books that were set in New Orleans. So we would have conventions of people who are fans of this certain series of novels would come to New Orleans, and we do tours with them and stuff like that, because it had nothing to do really with the novel, but there were a lot of the same settings. They were interested in seeing where things physically took place, or where the author had in mind when they described the place, or this place was supposed to be the home of this and this character. So it kind of really depends on what they like. We try, whenever possible, I try and tailor a tour to people's particular interests. But I honestly, I think the folkloric mystery of it, the kind of creepy mystery of it all, is kind of cool.
Yeah.
Like
Absolutely.
I said, if there was ever a place vampires would be perfect to be here. This would be a natural home for a vampire.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking about how weird a lot of this stuff is, and that towns without a good level of weirdness are boring. I don't know, there's got to be some grit. And, it seems like there's a lot of grit history. I mean, we all knew this about New Orleans, but I don't think a lot of us, it's like we just knew that New Orleans was interesting with the dark history, but I don't think a lot of us actually knew what that history was, So I love hearing the grit, that's for sure.
Man, we got nothing but grit. We got lots and lots and lots of grit. It's frustrating because there's so many things you want to talk about and you can't because you're trapped for time. Vampire Tour for me is one of my hardest tours to do because there's so much to talk about. I mean, I could take you past 1, 2, 3, 4 places where people were literally murdered for blood in the French Quarter.
Now, why do we associate that with vampirism and not voodoo?
Because they had nothing to do with voodoo. I mean, they're completely different beasts.
Are they?
Remember, voodoo's a religion. Voodoo's a religion. Voodoo does not use human sacrifice.
Okay, but I think of like a chicken blood and stuff. I mean, I know nothing about this. These are just my preconceived notions, but I think of blood sacrifices with animals. But you're saying that people blood has nothing to do with voodoo, and this was some sort of just weird serial killer or vampire thing.
I mean, there are lots, like, you go on Wikipedia, there's a classification, vampire murder, people killing other people for their blood is a type of crime.
Oh yeah. It's something I like to explore too. It's like, am I describing serial killers? Or am I describing with a blood fetish? Or am I describing what we call vampires? I mean, it doesn't make a difference to the dead whether you need the blood or you just think you need the blood, right?
Right. Yes, that's for sure.
But that's also a good question to ask. What's the difference between a vampire and a serial killer with a blood fetish? I mean, you see what I'm saying? You see where I'm going with this?
Mm-hmm. In theory, it's a little harder to fight off the former,
Yeah, you
shoot
think
them, they don't die.
Arguably. On the other hand, it's just really a fascinating thing to kind of pick it apart and try and understand where it all comes from. I don't want to get people to have the impression that I have all the answers. I got lots of answers. I've got lots of maybe so's. I've got lots of that's reasonable assumptions. I've got lots of wow, that's deeply disturbing and strange.
Right.
But I will never tell people I know the answer things. I hate that stuff and I will not do it. But I still think it's all worth discussing, I guess I require a lot of more of a listen, question to answer tour than me just shouting words at you. You know what I mean?
Right.
I always ask people if they have questions before, after. I love questions whenever possible because it lets me have an idea of what you want to know, but it also lets me explain things so everybody else can understand it better too. So it's great to do that way. It's just the Vampire Tour is such a tricky one because there's so much information that I have in my head, folklorically, historically, murder-wise, legendarily, that it's genuinely impossible to do the tour easily within 2 hours. I mean, it's so much information. I started doing a vampire VIP tour. I have some friends here who have a very cool speakeasy tucked away right behind one of the best jazz bars in the city, a real jazz bar. And it's a fantastically cool place, very small groups of people in. So if people do a vampire VIP with me, I give them, get the whole tour, but then we go over there, I get them into the speakeasy for free. And we go up into the speakeasy and we can actually have conversation. it's like an extra hour if you have any questions, or do you want me to tell you more things, or what do you want to know? So it's really more of a one-on-one kind of personal thing.
That's cool.
It's very cool. I've gotten some really good response from it, and I'm really glad I did that because there's just so much.
You gotta write a book. I don't know a publisher in the world who wouldn't pick that up in a heartbeat.
If I wrote a book, then anybody could pick up my book and know the things I know.
Once you retire, I mean.
Right.
Something
I've been doing it for 20 years. I'm probably not. I don't know when I'm going to retire. But yeah, I've had a lot of people ask about that, and I probably
when you're on your deathbad, write a book.
Yeah, I probably should start sketching things out.
Yeah,
because there's just so much to talk about, and it's just so cool.
It is cool. It is very cool.
It's a big blessing to live in a city where, I mean, if you look at the folklore in New Orleans, the people who came here, I mean, you understand that Aleister Crowley was here, right? The Great Beast.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he lived in New Orleans for a while.
Yeah.
Okay, it's that kind of place, right?
Right.
Oscar Wilde very much enjoyed his time in New Orleans when he was here, for example. Of course, Mark Twain was here. It's a very interesting place for art and writers and people who ponder the mysterious, the folkloric. But if you look at just the folklore of the city folklore has legends of witchcraft, ghosts, vampires, and voodoo. And the bayous are patrolled by werewolves.
Werewolves?
Yeah.
This is new for me. Okay, where does that stem from? Or
comes from the Cajuns.
The Cajuns, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Luke Garou stuff.
Rougarou. Bayous are patrolled by the Rougarou.
Huh.
Yep.
Awesome.
Essentially a Cajun werewolf.
Man, you guys got it all down there. That's not very
we really do. It's ridiculous.
Wow.
It's an embarrassment of riches, man.
Yeah,
that's gotta get over there the next time I visit my brother in Georgia. So.
Well, unfortunately, we're at the end here. Jonathan Weiss has been our guest. Jonathan, how do people find out about your tours? If they're coming through the area, how do they get in touch with you?
It's very easy. I mean, my website is the name of my company. Jonathan, Jonathan.
Mm-hmm.
Weiss, Weiss,
mm-hmm.
Tours, tours.com. So JonathanWeissTours.com, you can get on the internet. It's got pretty good information about all my tours, what we're offering, dates, times, stuff like that. You can purchase tickets through that. You can also send emails to me through that without a problem at all. That's probably the easiest way to do it. I could also hang on a second here. I can also give you my number. People can also call me for information at 504-356-2007. So I'm easily accessible by phone, accessible by email, the internet. And it's a lot of fun to be able to do what I do. And it's really rewarding when I get to share, I guess you'd say, my sense of wonder at the deeply strange and malevolent place that I live in, right, with people who are interested in knowing that it's more than just getting drunk and having beads thrown at you.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's definitely the aspect of it that we like. And it's definitely on my bucket list of places that my wife and I want to go. And so maybe when all this is over, I'll be able to get there.
Hey, give me a shout, man. I've got some good places for you to stay. I've got some good places for you to go. I'll be happy to drag you around a little bit.
Sounds great. Well, if ever you got anything you'd like to come on the show again, we'd love to have you. This has been very interesting and a lot of fun. And, I don't know, it scratched all the itches that both of us always have with these topics. So serial killers.
I've been waiting since we started this show for someone to tell me maybe vampires are real. So
right.
I like to say I'm cautiously agnostic.
Right.
Well,
I like that too. I like that too.
Maybe it's better than definitely.
All right. You've been listening to Jonathan Weiss here on Radio Wasteland. You can find out more by going to Jonathan Weiss, VEISS.com.
No, WEISS.
Oh, WEISS.
Pronounced with a V, spelled with a W.
Right. Pronounced with a V, spelled with a W. JonathanWeiss.com, tours.com. We'll put the link up on the site so that you don't have to listen to me. Thank you very much for being on the show. You've been listening.
It's my pleasure, y'all. I look forward to seeing you another time.
Yeah.
Take care.